Welcome back to our weekly Bible study. I've got some good news and I've got some bad news. The bad news is that Chris isn't going to be with us through this study, but the good news is that you got 5 more weeks of this ugly mug right here. Now, I loved walking through the Old Testament with you guys. I think it's an incredibly fascinating library of stories that show us who God is and what he was trying to do with the people of Israel, what he was able to accomplish with them. And then it ends and culminates in this period of silence, or perceived silence, when God is supposedly not talking to the world. But that period ends with the coming of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. So that's where we're going to be at during the process of this next series. We're going to take a look at who Jesus claimed to be through the lens of his disciple John. And this series is called I Am. And it's called that because we're going to walk through 14 instances in John where Jesus says, I am. And these instances, they're really broken down into 2 groups of 7. On one side of it, you have these 7 instances that we're going to work through today, where Jesus says just that phrase, I am, and that has some significant meaning that we're going to get to in a second. And the second set that we'll be working through is, we'll do that over the next 4 weeks. We'll get through one tonight, and the rest of them over the next 4 weeks is I am the statements that Jesus used. And he uses those to describe who he is and what that means in accordance with his relationship with God the Father and with us. In order to fully understand the argument that John spends his entire gospel making, we need to start at the beginning of his book. John's gospel is unique amongst the 4 gospels that we have. Matthew, Mark, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke are sometimes called the Synoptic Gospels. And they're called this because they share many of the same stories. And sometimes it's in the same order, sometimes it's in a little bit different order, but for the most part, they share very similar stories, and even to the point that sometimes they have like the exact same wording in the Greek. And what scholars have put together around that is that the reason these share similar stories is because they either used each other as resources or they had this other document that they used that we don't necessarily have today, but that influenced all 3 of them. And so they really do read very similarly, and if you look through them and you read through them, you'll see that. You'll notice some differences because of the authors, but the books feel very similar. But John isn't like that. John's different, and it's unique in the stories that it uses and the stories that John chose to tell about Jesus, and especially the way that John describes Jesus. And that starts in John 1. The first 14 verses, they almost serve as an outline or a prologue for the rest of John's book, maybe even a thesis statement for the argument that John is making about who his friend Jesus, who he walked the earth with, was. And starting in verse 1, going through verse 5 here, it reads, In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now this is a rich statement here. John has made, but the most significant part of this whole statement, the most significant part here we're going to focus on right in this moment is John is saying that the Word, Jesus, is God himself. And that's a pretty big claim. And in order to make it, you kind of have to have some arguments to back that up. So that's kind of the purpose of why John is writing this gospel. And he does that throughout the rest of the book. In fact, there are 7 times when Jesus makes the claim himself, in Jesus' own words, coming out of his mouth, as John records it, by calling himself I am. And in Greek, that phrase is ego eimi. And some of our English translations phrase a few of these instances where Jesus says this phrase different than just using the phrase I am. And they do that because sometimes it can be kind of clunky in English to read it that way. So they kind of switch it up a little bit. But we need to keep that in mind because I don't do that. So a few of the times that I say it, it's going to sound a little bit clunky, but that's the reason why. Now this phrase is significant because it's the same phrase that God utters to Moses in Exodus 3 during the burning bush encounter. And we talked about that a few weeks ago when Moses asked in verse 13, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, What is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God says back to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. This response on God's part, it leads to this phrase, this I am phrase, becoming the name of God himself. And in Hebrew, it's Yahweh. And this is where that idea of Yahweh comes from. We've heard it a lot. The way the Israelites, that's the way the Israelites refer to him the most often in the scriptures and even in their day-to-day lives, although they weren't supposed to say that name out loud. If someone claims this name in the first century Jewish world, that's a huge deal, even one that's punishable by death for blasphemy. And we'll see that kind of played out in Jesus' life later on. We see that in the response when Jesus himself does it. When he says this phrase, it's always a big deal every time. The first instance of it occurs in John 4. And this chapter contains the well-known story of the adulterous Samaritan woman who Jesus went out of his way to meet at this well during his travels. And Jesus basically shows this woman that he knows who she is inside and out. He understands her situation. He understands her world. And he tells her that God has sent someone to her people, and all people to bring them back into right relationship with him. And when she tells Jesus she's heard that the Messiah is coming, he says in verse 26 of chapter 4, I, the one speaking to you, I am. And when he then tells her afterwards is to go back to her village and tell all of them about what she's experienced here, and she does it. And that's a powerful scene because of the history between the Jews and the Samaritans. The fact that she listened to him is a big deal, and it shows that she believed what he was saying. In John 6, we find ourselves in another incredible story from John's gospel. This time, it's when Jesus is seen walking across the stormy waters by his disciples after he feeds the 5,000. Now, naturally, his disciples are afraid because there's a human being walking on water, and that's a crazy thing to see. But he says to them, I am. Don't be afraid, in verse 20. And then they let him on board as their fear goes away. Now, why is that an okay response? Just letting some dude who you know, who you've seen before, who just walked on water onto your boat. That's absolutely insane until that person says he is the God of Israel, the God you've grown up worshiping your whole life, while showing you an action like that only God could perform. Then you let that man on your boat. It makes sense then. And the claims continue in chapter 8 when Jesus finds himself speaking again in front of a group of people, including several Pharisees. And sometime, this is occurring sometime after he had already been making some pretty bold claims about who he was during the festival of the tabernacles. In verse 12, Jesus says the first, I am the statement, and the only one we're going to go, or the first one we're going to go over tonight, and the only one we're going to go over tonight. And it says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Now, that's a pretty obvious callback to the very beginning of the book, to this prologue. And John's continuing on that argument. But that doesn't change the truth of the statement just because it's a callback. Jesus is claiming to be the Messiah here. And the Pharisees are angry about it because that's just not something that you can do, especially when you don't have someone else there to back up your claims. What they fail to realize, and what Jesus informs them of, is that he isn't making the claim alone. He's not isolated here. He has someone else with him. His Father is his witness. And if they don't see that, then it's bad news for them. In verse 24, he makes that clear when he says, if you don't believe that I am, you will indeed die in your sins. And they still don't recognize him. So he continues on in verse 28 saying, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, talking about his own crucifixion here, then you will know that I am, and that I do nothing on my own, but speak just what the Father has taught me. The one who has sent me is with me. He has not left me alone, for I always do what pleases him. It's finally after this statement that some of these people start to believe what he's saying, and he continues on. The rest of the dialogue is about whose children these people are. These are Jewish people here. Don't make a mistake about it. These are Jewish people, and they know the promise that God made to Abraham, and they know that they are descendants of Abraham, and they know that they are supposed to be the blessing that God is going to use to bless the entire world. They understand that. So when Jesus starts to challenge them on this fact, it's not something that they take lightly. He tells them that unless they recognize him, they aren't children of Abraham, they're children of the devil. Now, this is about the worst thing that he could say to them in their eyes, but his backing for this is that he's reading the room. He can feel the circumstances here. He knows their intentions, and they are murderous intentions. They want to kill him. Yet he doesn't stop because he knows that the truth is the only thing that's going to set them free. The truth is the only thing that's going to alleviate their sin in their lives. And when he says in verse 58, before Abraham was, I am, he's telling them the reality of this situation. He speaks with the authority of God because he is God. They're united as one. All the promises these people have been waiting on are fulfilled in this man that's standing right in front of them. And their response is to pick up their stones. And he leaves them to their murderous hearts. Now, this is a significant moment in John's gospel because he shows his Jewish audience that he's writing to that they're only the people of Abraham as far as Christ himself. He's the true descendant that God will use to bless the nation, and that was always the plan. And that's why he can say before Abraham, even though he is alive 2,000 years after Abraham. It's kind of fascinating that there's 2,000 years between Abraham and Jesus, 2,000 years between Jesus and us. But this is similar to that prologue of the book again. It's another callback here where John tells us that the Word, Jesus, was there in the beginning. And that brings us to 5 I am statements, okay, and 1 I am the statement. Now, we've got 2 more I am statements to get through tonight. The first comes in chapter 13, which is the chapter in which Jesus kind of begins his final instructions to his disciples, and that actually lasts 5 whole chapters from 13 to 17. And after Jesus washes his disciples' feet and he shows them what it really looks like to be a servant leader and what his kingdom is going to look like and how he expects them to live, he tells them that the one who's going to betray him is with them in that room. And he says that in order to fulfill the scriptures, and this is another callback to that prologue in the beginning, a little bit after where we read. And he's showing them again that he's God. As he says in 13:19, I am telling you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am who I am. And the last time Jesus claims the name of God is in chapter 18, when Jesus is being arrested. They ask for Jesus of Nazareth, and he replies in verse 5, I am. And those arresting him fall back to the ground. Now that's a powerful scene, but it's one that makes perfect sense in the context of his claim. This is the way that people react when they see God. They fall back in fear. Despite the occupation of these arresting men, they were soldiers. We shouldn't expect anything different than the way the disciples reacted on the boat when they were afraid, or the way that Moses reacted to the burning bush when he was afraid. That they react with fear and trembling. That's the response when you see God. And this isn't any different. All in all, Jesus makes the claim of God's name 7 times. The number has some significance in the fact that it consistently meant in this time completeness and unity in the culture that John was writing in and who he was writing to. They would have understood that. And what that says to us is that God the Father and Christ the Son, who John walked the earth with and lived an experienced relationship with and dedicated the rest of his life to serving, they're one. And that is a big claim. So with all that being said, where does that leave us here today when we read through John's gospel and we see these statements that Jesus has made? C.S. Lewis answers this question pretty well with his liar, lunatic, or Lord trilemma. Basically, through the different instances that we've went over, Jesus claimed to be God by not only using God's name, but also claiming to be able to do things that only God could do. Some examples of that would be alleviating people's sin problem in their life, or judging people at the end of time, or being there before the beginning of time. Those examples and what he has claimed, because of these claims made by Jesus himself about himself, we really only have 3 options of how to respond. If he made those claims, knowing that they weren't true, then he's a liar, and he can't be a good teacher because he doesn't tell the truth. if he made those claims and he believed that they were true, but they are false, then he's a lunatic and he can't be a good teacher because he's crazy. But if he made those claims and he believed that they were true, and they are, then the only option is that he's Lord. And looking over the past 2,000 years since Jesus walked the earth, I think it's a pretty good shot that he was telling the truth and that he's Lord. And here's the thing, if we believe that, and I think that if you are here and you're watching this with me as we're going through this, if you're participating, I think you do believe that. If we believe that, then we have to respond to everything that he told us. And in this gospel, in the other gospels, about the way that we are supposed to live out our lives, we have to respond to that faithfully. And we have to do that every single day if Jesus is Lord. So over the next 4 weeks, we're going to take that knowledge and that situation and that way of living into account as we work through the remaining I am the statements to better understand what that means for us and what kind of God Jesus was telling the world he was and still is today. Have a great week.